The luxury shopping mall buzzed with a vibrant energy, filled with the sounds of chatter and the clinking of shopping bags. Shoppers glided through the high-end boutiques, showcasing their latest purchases, while others reclined in the plush seating areas, sipping artisanal coffee or engrossed in their smartphones. The air was infused with the enticing aroma of designer fragrances and freshly brewed espresso, creating an atmosphere that felt almost sacred to those who frequented it. The polished marble floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights, transforming the space into a temple of consumerism, where the affluent and the aspirational indulged their desires. Among the crowd sat James Thompson, a 78-year-old retired veteran. He rested quietly on a sleek wooden bench near the central atrium, his posture straight and dignified. He wasn't there to shop. His granddaughter had insisted he join her on this outing, but he preferred to stay put while she explored the stores. Dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt and a gray cardigan, James exuded a calm self-assurance, embodying a man who had weathered many storms in life. Though the world had changed around him, he remained a steadfast symbol of resilience and sacrifice. As he observed the ebb and flow of the mall, a man in an expensive navy suit strode purposefully through the space. Mark Johnson, the general manager of the shopping mall, carried himself with an air of authority, believing he was the most important person in the room. His impeccably tailored suit and shiny leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his sharp gaze scanned the floor like a predator surveying its territory. Mark took pride in maintaining the exclusivity of the mall, ensuring only the right people frequented its halls. When his eyes settled on James, a frown creased his face, as he viewed the elderly black veteran sitting alone as a problem to be resolved. Mark approached James, adjusting his cuff as he cleared his throat, his voice dripping with a false politeness. "Excuse me, sir," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you waiting for someone?" James looked up, meeting Mark's gaze with a calm indifference. He had faced men like this before, those who mistook their position for power. "I am," he replied evenly. "My granddaughter is shopping. I'm just resting my legs." Mark's expression remained neutral, but a flicker of impatience crossed his face. "I see," he said. "I hope you understand this area is reserved for paying customers. We strive to maintain a certain standard here." He let the words linger, watching for a reaction. James remained unfazed, his sharp gaze unwavering. "I served in the military," James replied, his tone steady and firm. "I fought for this country. I believe I've earned the right to sit wherever I please." A smirk flitted across Mark's lips, though it never reached his eyes. "Oh, I don't doubt that, sir, but things change. We have policies, and unfortunately, we can't make exceptions for everyone." He glanced around, ensuring that nearby shoppers could hear the exchange. A few people slowed their pace, intrigued by the unfolding conversation, while most chose to ignore it. James sighed, shifting his cane slightly. He had lived long enough to recognize where this conversation was headed. "Policies," he echoed. "And which one says a man can't sit down while waiting for his family?" Mark's smirk deepened as he leaned closer. "It's not about rules, sir. It's about keeping this space suitable for our clientele." He let the implication hang in the air, his gaze flicking briefly to James's modest clothing, his dark skin and his age. "If you're not making a purchase, perhaps you'd feel more comfortable elsewhere." At that moment the atmosphere in the mall shifted, the sounds of conversation fading slightly, as if the space itself had become aware of the weight of Mark's words. A young woman near the perfume counter halted mid-spray, her eyes darting between the two men. A businessman nearby pretended to check his watch, stealing glances at the confrontation, while an older woman near the cafe gasped audibly. James inhaled deeply, tightening his grip on his cane just a fraction. He had been called many things in his life, endured far worse than this, but that didn't make it any less appalling. His pulse remained steady, his breath even. He would not give Mark the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. As Richard straightened his tie, seemingly pleased with himself, the heavy silence was abruptly cut by a new voice. "Did I just hear that right?" It was deep, calm, and undeniably commanding. All eyes turned to the source. A man had stepped forward from the entrance of a nearby store, his broad frame and unmistakable presence shifting the very energy of the room. He was none other than Chris Evans. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone fumbled with their phone, already opening the camera app. A security guard by the jewelry store straightened, his mouth slightly open as he recognized the Hollywood star. "Mr. Evans," Mark stammered, momentarily caught off guard. Chris raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. His intense gaze locked onto Mark, then flickered to James for just a second. The weight of his presence was palpable. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost deadly, he asked, "Could you repeat that for me?" As the crowd held its breath, it became clear that the tension in the air had shifted dramatically, and the outcome of this confrontation was about to unfold. This rewritten part maintains the essence and style of the original story, while introducing new character names, descriptions, and interactions. The setting and character motivations remain intact, while the call to action for viewers is subtly included at the end of the narrative. As the atmosphere in the mall grew heavier, Mark Johnson's pride seemed to swell. He had always prided himself on his ability to manage the mall and keep it exclusive, a reputation he fiercely protected. The glimmer of luxury surrounding him filled him with a sense of superiority. He considered himself the gatekeeper of this opulent space, deciding who belonged and who didn't, based on a set of unwritten rules he had created in his mind. With a practiced smile plastered on his face, Mark took a step closer to James, who remained seated, his cane resting beside him. The elderly veteran's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to Mark's simmering impatience. "You see, sir," Mark began, his tone dripping with condescension, "this mall is a place for those who appreciate the finer things in life. Sometimes it's best to be mindful of that." James raised an eyebrow at Mark's words, a hint of disbelief flickering across his face. "I'm well aware of where I am," he replied, his voice steady and unyielding. "I'm just here waiting for my granddaughter, and I have every right to sit here while I do so." Mark's jaw tightened slightly, and his smile faltered for just a moment. The veteran's calm response seemed to challenge his authority, and he couldn't let that stand. "Respectfully, I must insist that this area is intended for customers who are actively shopping," he said, his voice rising just a notch. "We have a reputation to uphold, and it's important for us to maintain an atmosphere that appeals to our clientele." James felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had fought for this country, served honorably, and yet here he was, being treated as though he didn't belong. "I understand your concern," he replied, his voice measured, "but I'm not loitering, I'm simply resting, and if you must know, I've earned my place in this world through service and sacrifice." Mark's smirk returned, but this time it lacked the confidence it usually carried. "I'm sure you have your stories, but the reality is, times have changed," he countered, glancing around to gauge the reactions of nearby shoppers. He wanted them to witness his authority, to see him in control. A few people nearby had started to pay attention, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort, but most tried to ignore the escalating situation, focusing instead on their own shopping. "I see," James said, tilting his head slightly. "So according to you, a man who has served his country doesn't deserve to take a break in a public space, simply because he isn't making a purchase?" Mark leaned in closer, his tone dripping with disdain. "It's not about the rules, sir," he asserted. "It's about keeping this environment suitable for our customers. We want to ensure that everyone feels comfortable, and that the ambiance is maintained." At this point, James felt his patience begin to wear thin. He had faced discrimination before, but this felt particularly insidious. "Comfortable for whom?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Are you suggesting that my presence here is a disturbance? That an elderly black man doesn't fit your idea of a respectable customer?" Mark hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was clear that he was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not in front of others. "I'm merely pointing out that perhaps you might find another place to rest," he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. The tension in the air was palpable. Shoppers had begun to whisper amongst themselves, their eyes darting between the two men. Some were clearly uncomfortable, while others watched with a mixture of intrigue and indignation. A young woman standing by the perfume counter had frozen mid-spray, her eyes wide as she processed the unfolding confrontation. A businessman pretended to be engrossed in his watch, but his gaze lingered on the escalating exchange. The muffled sound of conversation faded into the background, replaced by the weight of Mark's words. James inhaled deeply, refusing to let this man's arrogance provoke him. "You may think you hold the power here, but I assure you, that's a misconception," he stated, his grip on his cane tightening slightly as he continued. I've lived through harder times than you could imagine, and I won't let anyone dictate where I can sit, especially not someone who doesn't understand the meaning of respect. Mark's confidence began to waver, but he quickly masked it with bravado. Listen, old man, he retorted, I didn't ask for your life story. I'm simply enforcing the standards of this establishment. Just then the atmosphere shifted once more as a commanding voice pierced through the tension. Did I just hear that right? The crowd turned as a tall figure emerged from a nearby store, instantly drawing attention. Dressed casually in a black t-shirt and dark jeans, Chris Evans strode forward, his presence exuding a powerful charisma that silenced the onlookers. His deep voice carried an authoritative weight that demanded attention. Mark's confident facade cracked as he recognized the Hollywood star. Mr. Evans, he stammered, unsure of how to proceed. Chris raised a hand, cutting Mark off. Let's clarify what just happened here, he said, his gaze locking onto Mark with an intensity that left no room for defiance. The crowd held its collective breath, knowing that the dynamics of this confrontation were about to change dramatically. As eyes turned to Chris, it became clear that this moment would have ramifications far beyond the mall, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. In this moment, the power balance had shifted, and the crowd was eager to witness what would happen next. James, though still seated, felt a surge of hope as Chris stepped forward, ready to challenge the injustice that had been directed at him. The tension in the air was palpable as Chris Evans stepped forward, his commanding presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the mall. Mark Johnson, who had been so assured just moments ago, now found himself on the defensive, his smirk replaced by uncertainty. The crowd, intrigued by the unfolding drama, held its breath, anxious to see how this confrontation would play out. What did you just say to him? Chris demanded, throwing a sharp glance at Mark. His voice was calm but carried an underlying intensity that demanded respect. The crowd began to lean in closer, their curiosity piqued by the Hollywood star's unexpected involvement. Mark cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. I was simply explaining our policies, Mr. Evans, he replied, his tone attempting to sound authoritative but lacking confidence. This area is reserved for paying customers, and I was just ensuring that our standards are upheld. Chris stepped closer, his gaze unwavering as he focused on the general manager. Standards? Is that what you call treating an elderly veteran like he doesn't belong? This man fought for his country, and you think you have the right to tell him where he can sit? The crowd murmured in agreement, many nodding their heads in support of James. The older man remained seated, his composure steady, but inside he felt a surge of gratitude toward Chris for standing up for him. He had faced discrimination before, but seeing a public figure challenge it gave him a sense of solidarity he hadn't expected. Mark's face flushed as he realized the tide was turning against him. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules of the mall, but now he felt exposed. I didn't mean it that way, he stammered, desperate to reclaim the narrative. I was just making sure the environment is appropriate for our clientele. Appropriate, Chris echoed incredulously. So telling a man like Mr. Thompson to go back to where he came from is what you consider appropriate. That's not just disrespectful, it's downright disgraceful. His voice rose, filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The crowd began to react, some whispering their agreement, others expressing shock at Mark's words. James, still seated, felt a mix of emotions. He had endured many forms of prejudice throughout his life, but hearing it articulated so brazenly stung. He had never expected to find himself at the center of such a dramatic confrontation. Yet here he was, and he felt empowered by Chris's defense. You're making a mistake by thinking you can bully people into submission, Chris continued, his tone unwavering. Men like Mr. Thompson deserve respect, not derision. You may think your title gives you power, but real power comes from treating others with dignity. Mark's hands clenched at his sides, the humiliation mounting as he glanced around at the onlookers. Their expressions ranged from pity to disdain, and he felt the walls closing in around him. This is just a misunderstanding, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. I was only trying to maintain order. Order? Chris challenged, letting the word hang in the air. What kind of order requires you to disrespect a veteran who has sacrificed so much? You should be ashamed of yourself. The crowd began to nod along, their support for James growing stronger. Feeling the pressure, Mark attempted to shift the focus back to himself. "I run this mall," he said defiantly, though the bravado was fading. "I have to uphold certain standards to keep our customers happy." "Happy?" Chris scoffed. "What's happy about making someone feel unwelcome? You're using your position to exert control over others instead of creating a place where everyone feels valued." The crowd began to murmur louder, their indignation rising as they witnessed the confrontation. People pulled out their phones, recording the interaction, capturing the moment for social media. The tension hung thick in the air, and it was clear that this incident would not be forgotten easily. James watched, a mix of pride and disbelief swelling within him. He had not anticipated that someone like Chris would take a stand for him, yet here he was, and the power of the moment was undeniable. It was a reminder that, even in the face of discrimination, solidarity could arise from unexpected places. Mark, feeling increasingly cornered, tried to regain control of the situation. "Look, I don't need this," he said, his voice rising in frustration. "You have no idea what it's like to run a place like this." Chris took a step closer, his eyes locked onto Mark's. "And you have no idea what it's like to be treated with contempt, simply for existing in a space that you deem exclusive. This isn't just about you or your mall, it's about recognizing the humanity in everyone." The weight of Chris's words hung in the air, reverberating through the crowd. Many felt a surge of empowerment, realizing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment. James, though still seated, felt the winds of change blowing around him. This was more than just a confrontation, it was a declaration that injustice would not go unchallenged. As the tension reached its peak, Chris turned to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "We all have a responsibility to stand up against discrimination, to call out disrespect when we see it, and to support one another. This is our community, and we won't allow anyone to tear it apart." The crowd erupted in murmurs of agreement, some clapping softly, others nodding in appreciation. Mark stood there, visibly shaken, as he realized he had lost, not just the argument, but the respect of those around him as well. The power dynamics had shifted, and he was now standing alone, surrounded by witnesses, who would not forget this day. In that moment, James felt a renewed sense of hope. He had faced adversity throughout his life, but today he was not alone. With Chris Evans standing by his side, the message was loud and clear. Standing up for what is right is a powerful act, and together, they would weave a change that could not easily be undone. The atmosphere in the mall had shifted dramatically, the collective tension palpable as Chris Evans stepped into the fray. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of every shopper in the vicinity. Mark Johnson, the general manager, stood frozen, the sudden realization that he was no longer the center of attention dawning on him. As Chris approached, the crowd sensed an impending confrontation that could change the course of the encounter. "Excuse me," Chris began, his voice steady and commanding. "Did I just hear you tell this man to go back to where he came from?" He directed his gaze firmly at Mark, his expression a mixture of disbelief and determination. The crowd, now fully engaged, leaned in closer, eager to witness how this public figure would handle the situation. Mark, caught off guard by Chris's unexpected arrival, attempted to regain his composure. "Mr. Evans, I was simply enforcing the mall's policies," he stammered, struggling to maintain an air of authority. "This area is meant for paying customers, and we have standards to uphold." Chris shook his head, his brow furrowing in frustration. "Standards? Is this how you define them? By disrespecting a veteran who has sacrificed so much for this country? That's not just wrong, it's disgraceful." His tone was firm, and as he spoke, the crowd murmured in agreement, their support for James Thompson growing stronger. James, still seated on the bench, felt a mix of emotions wash over him. It was both comforting and empowering to see someone like Chris stand up for him. He had faced discrimination before, but this moment felt different. It was a public acknowledgement of the injustice he had endured. Mark's composure began to crack as the crowd reacted to Chris's words. "You don't understand the pressures of managing a place like this," he replied defensively, his voice rising slightly. "I have to make sure everyone feels welcome, and sometimes that means enforcing the rules." Chris took a step closer, his intensity unwavering. "Enforcing rules shouldn't come at the expense of someone's dignity," he challenged. You think your title gives you power, but real power lies in treating others with respect. You're not just running a mall, you're shaping a community. Why would you choose to alienate someone who deserves to be here? Mark spluttered, struggling to find a response. I never meant to offend anyone. I was just trying to do my job, he insisted, but the confidence in his voice was slipping away. The crowd was no longer on his side, and he could feel their judgment weighing heavily on him. Chris turned to the onlookers, his voice rising with passion. We all have a responsibility to speak out against this kind of treatment. It's not just about one man, it's about standing up for what's right. We can't let fear or prejudice dictate our actions. His words resonated with the crowd, many of whom had experienced similar disrespect in their lives. As the murmurs of agreement spread through the onlookers, James felt a surge of hope. This was more than just a confrontation. It was a collective stand against discrimination. He had fought for this country, and now he felt a sense of solidarity that he hadn't anticipated. Mark, now visibly shaken, looked around at the crowd, realizing that his authority was crumbling. I didn't mean to make it personal, he protested weakly. I just want to maintain a certain environment here. Chris raised an eyebrow, his expression unyielding. And what kind of environment do you think you're creating when you push away those who have earned their place? This mall should be a space for everyone, rich or poor, veteran or civilian. Everyone deserves to feel welcomed and respected. The crowd erupted into applause, their support for James and Chris evident. Mark stood there, his face reddening with embarrassment, as he absorbed the weight of their reactions. He had underestimated the power of community, and now he faced the consequences. Let's be clear, Chris continued, his voice steady and authoritative. It's not just about this moment, it's about the message we send to everyone watching. If we allow discrimination to go unchecked, we're failing not just ourselves but future generations. As the crowd rallied behind Chris, Mark realized he had lost control of the narrative. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sense of vulnerability he wasn't accustomed to. The onlookers, many with their phones out recording the incident, had transformed into a united front against his arrogance. James, witnessing the shift unfold, felt a mixture of pride and relief. He had endured much throughout his life, but seeing Chris advocate for him ignited a fire within him. Thank you for standing up for me, he said quietly to Chris, his voice filled with gratitude. Chris flashed a supportive smile, his eyes filled with determination. You deserve to be heard, sir. We all do. Let's make sure this never happens again. The crowd nodded in agreement, their murmurs of support echoing through the mall. As Mark stood there, acutely aware of the disapproval surrounding him, he knew that the tide had turned. The incident would not only impact him, but would also spark conversations about respect and inclusion in the community. With the crowd rallying behind James and Chris, the stage was set for a powerful resolution. It was a moment that would resonate far beyond the walls of the mall, a reminder that standing up for what is right is a collective effort, and together they could weave a change that would not easily be forgotten. As the energy in the mall shifted, Chris Evans stood firm, his voice resonating with conviction. The crowd, now fully engaged, leaned in closer, eager to witness how this confrontation would unfold. Mark Johnson, feeling the weight of their gazes, could sense the tide turning against him. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and it became clear that this was no longer just a disagreement between two men. It had evolved into a public stand against discrimination. Let's be real, Mark, Chris continued, his tone unwavering as he addressed the general manager. What you said to Mr. Thompson is not just offensive, it's a reflection of a mindset that has no place in our society. You're perpetuating a cycle of disrespect and that needs to stop. His words hung heavily in the air, punctuated by the murmurs of agreement from the crowd. James Thompson, still seated on the bench, felt a swell of pride as he listened to Chris. This was a moment he had longed for, a moment where someone recognized the dignity he had fought to uphold throughout his life. He had faced discrimination many times, but witnessing Chris take a stand made him feel seen and valued. It was a powerful reminder that he was not alone. Mark's facade of confidence began to crumble further as the crowd's support for Chris and James grew louder. You don't understand the pressures I face, Mark protested weakly, attempting to defend his actions. I have to keep this place running smoothly. That means enforcing the rules. Chris stepped closer, his voice calm but filled with intensity. Enforcing the rules shouldn't mean dehumanizing people. You can maintain order without belittling others. The real measure of a community is how we treat those who are most vulnerable. By pushing Mr. Thompson away, you're not just disrespecting him. You're disrespecting everyone who has ever felt marginalized. The crowd began to respond with nods of agreement, their expressions shifting from passive observers to active participants in this moment of truth. People pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation, capturing the essence of a pivotal moment that would resonate far beyond the mall's walls. Imagine how this affects not just Mr. Thompson, but everyone who witnesses this kind of behavior, Chris continued, addressing not just Mark but the entire crowd. It sends a message that certain people don't belong, that their voices and experiences don't matter. That's not the kind of community we want to be a part of. James felt a renewed sense of hope as he absorbed Chris's words. This was a rallying cry for change, an invitation for everyone to reflect on their own actions and the impact they had on others. He had spent years fighting for respect, and now, with Chris's support, he felt empowered to stand up for himself and others who had faced similar injustices. Mark shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his earlier attempts to maintain control were failing. The crowd's energy was palpable, and he could feel their judgment weighing heavily on him. "This isn't fair," he exclaimed, desperation creeping into his voice. "I was just trying to do my job." Chris looked Mark directly in the eye, his expression serious. "Your job is to create an inclusive environment, not to dictate who belongs based on your own prejudices. You have a choice. You can either choose to uphold dignity and respect, or continue down this path of exclusion." At that moment, the crowd erupted in applause, their support for James and Chris echoing throughout the mall. The atmosphere had transformed from one of tension to one of solidarity, as individuals recognized the power of standing together against injustice. Mark's face turned crimson as he absorbed the reality of the situation. He had underestimated the impact of his words and actions, and now he stood alone in the spotlight, stripped of his authority. The crowd was no longer on his side, and he realized that he had lost not only the battle but also the respect of those around him. James, feeling a surge of empowerment, decided to speak up. "I appreciate what you're doing, Chris," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about me, it's about all of us who have been treated as less than. We deserve to be seen and heard, regardless of our background." Chris nodded in agreement, his expression filled with respect. "Exactly, Mr. Thompson. We all have a role to play in creating a society where everyone is valued. Change starts with each of us, and it's our responsibility to hold ourselves and others accountable." As the crowd continued to cheer and support, Mark realized that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone present. The incident would serve as a catalyst for discussions about respect, inclusion, and the importance of standing up against discrimination. The ripple effects of this moment would undoubtedly extend beyond the mall, igniting conversations in homes, workplaces, and communities. Feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, Mark took a deep breath. "I apologize," he said, his voice shaky but sincere. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I see now how my words can hurt, and I promise to do better." Chris smiled, acknowledging Mark's attempt at accountability. "That's a step in the right direction, Mark. It's important to learn from our mistakes and grow from them." As the crowd began to disperse, the impact of what had happened lingered in the air. James felt a sense of fulfillment wash over him. He had stood his ground, and with the help of Chris Evans, he had sent a powerful message about the importance of respect and dignity. This day would not be forgotten. It was a reminder that change is possible when individuals come together to challenge injustice. As they exited the mall, James felt hopeful for the future, knowing that the conversation had just begun. Together they would continue to weave a tapestry of change, one thread at a time. As the crowd began to disperse, a sense of empowerment lingered in the air, the echoes of applause still resonating in the marble-floored mall. James Thompson, now standing with a newfound sense of dignity, watched as Chris Evans exchanged a few final words with the onlookers, his presence still commanding despite the shift in energy. It was a moment of triumph, not just for James, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or disrespected. Meanwhile, Mark Johnson stood slightly apart, his once confident demeanor replaced by a deep sense of embarrassment. As the realization of what had just occurred sank in, he felt the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. The exchanges, the recordings, and the murmurs of discontent would undoubtedly ripple through social media and the wider community, forever altering how he was perceived. Back in his office, Mark slammed the door behind him, his hands trembling from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with notifications. He had already received several messages from colleagues and friends, all expressing disbelief over the incident. As he opened his social media accounts, his heart sank. His name was trending, accompanied by hashtags like racist mall manager and boycott Mark Johnson. How did it come to this? He muttered to himself, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He had simply wanted to maintain control, to uphold the standards of the mall. But now he was the one being judged, the one facing humiliation. The videos circulating online showed his condescending remarks, his dismissive attitude, and the moment he had told James to go back to where he came from. The realization hit him hard. He had underestimated the power of public opinion and the impact of his words. The narrative had shifted, and he was now the villain in a story that had been unfolding for far too long. Corporate headquarters had already called, announcing an investigation into his conduct. Rumors swirled that a board meeting was scheduled for the following morning to discuss his future with the company. Meanwhile, in the bustling mall, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had managed to stand up for himself, and with Chris's unexpected support, he had made a statement that went beyond his personal experience. As he walked towards the exit with his granddaughter, he felt lighter, more empowered than he had in years. The sense of community that had formed around him was uplifting, and he realized that today's events had sparked a change that extended beyond the mall's walls. "Grandpa, that was amazing," his granddaughter exclaimed, her eyes wide with admiration. "I can't believe Chris Evans stood up for you like that." James chuckled softly, his heart swelling with pride. "It's important to stand up for what's right, my dear. We all have a role to play in creating a world where everyone is treated with respect." As they stepped outside into the sunlight, James noticed a group of people gathered nearby, discussing the events that had transpired. Some were still filming, capturing the conversation for social media, while others shared their thoughts about the importance of standing up against discrimination. It was heartening to see that the community had rallied together, ready to engage in meaningful discussions about respect and inclusion. Back at the mall, the management team was already in crisis mode. Mark's assistant, Claire, entered the office, her expression serious. "Richard, you need to know that the board is taking this very seriously. They've already started receiving complaints, and the video is going viral. This could end your career here." Mark felt his stomach drop. "I can fix this," he insisted, though the conviction in his voice was waning. "I just need to explain my side of the story." Claire shook her head, her arms crossed tightly. "You crossed a line, and now everyone knows it. People are angry, and it's not just about you anymore. You didn't just disrespect Mr. Thompson. You've hurt the entire community. They're not going to forget this." As she spoke, Mark's mind raced. How had he let it get this far? The pressure of maintaining the mall's image had clouded his judgment, leading him to make decisions that contradicted the very values he claimed to uphold. He realized that he had a choice to make. He could either continue to defend his actions, or he could take a step back and acknowledge the damage he had done. "I need to apologize publicly," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to show people that I understand the gravity of my mistake." Claire looked at him, surprised by his sudden shift in attitude. "That might be a start, but it's gonna take more than just an apology to rebuild your reputation. You need to commit to making real changes." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the mall, James and his granddaughter walked away, leaving behind the chaos of the day. He felt a sense of hope for the future, knowing that the dialogue about respect and community had been ignited. The events of that day would not be forgotten. They would serve as a reminder that change is possible when individuals unite to challenge injustice. In the days to come, conversations would flourish, and the ripple effects of that moment would spread far and wide. James had fought for respect, and with the support of Chris Evans in the community, he had woven a narrative of resilience and empowerment that would inspire others to do the same. Together, they had taken a stand, and it was just the beginning of a much-needed change.